to remember that that this being part one, part two is next week at the same time at 10 a.m. on 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Central Time next week. Okay, Crystal, can you hear me? Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So without further ado, I'm going to let y'all know that I have had the pleasure and the grace of working with Crystal for pretty close to 8 years now, at least 7 years. We were talking about that yesterday. Like I said, it has been my pleasure. It has been my grace. I've learned so much. So with that said, Crystal, take it away and tell us what we're talking about.
All right. Good morning, y'all. So it has been a long time since I've done a webinar, so I am a tad bit nervous, and I usually always have something to say, but when I get nervous, I forget what I'm going to say. So just bear with me just a little bit. Welcome to part one of our Voices Summer Training Series. We are so excited. I'm going to talk a little bit more about voices later, but this is our first summer training series in a couple years now. We've been in a rebranding, rebuilding phase. So seeing this project through to completion is a proud, proud moment for our task force. We have worked really, really hard to put some content together and get back to presenting like we used to years ago. So this is understanding sexual violence within the context of an anti-oppression framework. Very fancy sounding title, but I hope by the end of this we walk away with some really good stuff. And part one of this webinar or this series is really going to focus on education. So I'm going to be doing a lot of talking. I genuinely hope it doesn't feel like talking at you, but it's the educational component to this. Next week, we will have panel members that are also going to be on with me, going to have a completely different feel towards it. You're going to be able to interact a little more with those panel members, and we will have this continuation and a practical on-the-ground look at anti-oppression work in Texas. So hope you come back for that next week, like Wendy said. Same time, just a different Friday. Okay, so about TAASA. TAASA is our statewide advocacy organization that works to address and eliminate sexual violence through public policy, training, prevention work, and support to programs that serve survivors of sexual violence. Voices is an umbrella program here at TAASA. Voices stands for Valuing Our Identities, Cultivating Equitable Spaces, and it is the statewide team formerly known as TAASA's Diversity Task Force. We were known as the Diversity Task Force for many, many years, probably most notably known for our support to get people to the statewide conference through our scholarship program. That's been going on for well over 10 years. I started with the Diversity Task Force back in 2012 on the scholarship committee, and then in 2013 started working in co-leadership with Nicole Minton Martinez and Rose Luna, who obviously Rose is now TASA's CEO, and I have been very grateful to be a part of this. I stepped into coordinating this position last year, and it has been a true joy and a true pleasure. Diversity Task Force has always been something near and dear to my heart, so it's very much an honor to continue our mission, which is to facilitate access to reliable and accurate resources to develop cultural capacity. Our goal is to inform, empower, and support service providers in their goal to offer culturally informed services. So let's get into some content for today. Our learning objectives, this is what I hope that you will be able to walk away from this webinar with, the ability to identify the difference between a non-discrimination service and an anti-oppressive practice. We're going to get really far into that as this webinar moves along. Fully recognizing this might be a topic that you have not trained on or have very little experience with. please use that chat box. Wendy will kind of look at those questions, and we will have opportunity both for me to take questions as we move through this and some of the bigger questions at the end once we get through all the content. And then another piece of this that I want y'all to use the chat box for is aha moments. So as we're going through this content, when something clicks and it sits in a way maybe you haven't heard it that way before, or just like, aha, that's it. That's what I've been saying for 12 years. Use that chat box too to share those aha moments. And then at the end of this presentation, I want you as an audience member to be able to recognize the core components of the anti-oppression framework that I'm going to lay out for you, and then name the 4 principles of social justice advocacy. So those are the learning objectives for today. I always, when I start talking about anti-oppression work for many, many years, I start with the roots of violence and reminding and centering around what we see in terms of working with survivors is an outcome. It has a root to it. So I use this tree example. I'm an old primary prevention person at heart. We've seen a lot of this stuff. If you've trained in primary prevention, you have probably seen this roots of violence slide from some of our colleagues from way back. The leaves of this tree are the experiences, the risk factors for the perpetration of sexual violence. So this is what we see in our day-to-day work. We see the outcome of these roots of violence. So that's really difficult to explain to people outside of our world, is that this is rooted in something, because a lot of times it feels more comfortable to say this is just something that exists. It's unalterable. Deal with it, take care of the people that it's happened to, accept it, and that's just how it's going to be. And if you're an advocate and an activist at heart the way I am, we are not good with accepting things we feel like we can change, and not always knowing the difference. But this is something I truly, at my core, believe that sexual violence does not have to exist in our society, and it is rooted in social inequalities. It is rooted in oppression. So to do work in the anti-sexual violence movement is doing anti-oppression work. And that is just something I believe and have believed for many, many years. In terms of my personal experience, I am a survivor of sexual violence, specifically campus sexual violence. So, but I had these ideas and I had this belief well before those experiences came to be a part of my story. And that it just doesn't, sexual violence does not have to be a part of our communities. And I applaud the work that you're doing to give my children a violence-free Texas. So what oppression? And 2 questions I hope to answer throughout this webinar is, what is anti-oppression work? And what does it have to do with the work I'm doing on a day-to-day basis? So this is where we're going to start. Just the good old, what is oppression? We use this word a lot within the movement, but sometimes we really don't know what that actually means. So oppression is the use of power to disempower, marginalize, silence, or subordinate one social group or category, and that is often done to empower or privilege the oppressor. And this is a deep, deep definition. We're going to get really far into this. But ultimately, our work with sexual violence, our work in ending sexual violence and supporting those who have had those experiences is connected to bigger sociopolitical issues. And I love this quote, no single oppression holds more weight than another, because they cannot exist without each other. So a lot of today's conversation is going to be rooted in these layers that people who come to us and people who don't but have had experiences of sexual violence have to live through. And these are lived experiences. And I know we use the word barriers a lot. I'm going to try to refrain from using that word barriers throughout this presentation, because as we get into this content, I want you to see that people who come from marginalized communities have a very different lived experience, and those layers are very, very deep, and it is part of the lived experience. It's not just a barrier to overcome, because that implies that we work hard enough, we train. I'm an athlete also, so if I train hard enough, I'm going to be able to jump that next block. Not necessarily when we're talking about oppression. Is if I behave well enough, if I conform well enough, if I make the right money or have the right degree, I'm going to automatically stop the woman that follows me in the fancy jewelry store and assumes I don't have that money to pay, and I'm there to stick that necklace in my purse. So as a professional, I still am a fat, dark Latina, and those experiences have not left my life just yet. Those are still things I deal with on a day-to-day basis. So ultimately, our work is to promote the dignity, respect, and empowerment of survivors. So that is why we do anti-oppression work. And change takes time. There is no quick and fast way through this. Adopting, a checklist of do this, do this, do this, and a recipe of, throw in some eggs, throw in some flour, you come out with a cake, is not the same as what it's going to take to overcome and to dismantle systems that oppress people. The change does take time, but it's worth the investment, and it's work that's necessary for us to do as advocates. So we're going to start with the video. The picture I had on screen is a piece of art that's a pretty famous piece of art, and it's based on the poetry of Stacieann Chin, who is a famous activist, and she has a very famous poem from 2007. All oppression is connected is one of the core themes of that poem, and widely quoted by social justice advocates. So here's a short snippet. It's an interview with her where she talks about how she formulates and comes to these ideas. And it's a really, really short. We have somebody saying they love that quote. Yep, this one sits with me all the time too. So we're going to just watch her on screen for just a second and then get some commentary from y'all. So hoping that it works. So yesterday I was having problems. Oh, come on.
So I noticed that your work intersects race, class, gender, and sexual orientation and sexuality. Were these ideas that had always been present in your work, or did they develop over time?
I started to read the works of June Jordan and Audre Lorde, and I started to read work that was maybe pushing me towards a more intersectional philosophy. I think if you form connections with people, if your life expands, then it is natural that the people who you're concerned about, the issues you're concerned about, expands also. I kind of don't know how it is that I can be 44 years old and think I'm just fighting for lesbian rights, or think I'm just fighting for the rights of immigrant Jamaicans without considering Mexican Americans, without considering Guatemalan Americans, without considering Nigerian Americans, without considering African Americans. All oppression is connected. If you line up all the people who are against the people and line up all the people who are against the gay people and line up all the people who are against poor women or against abortion, and you put them all in the same corner, chances are they're related to each other, they know each other, and so therefore it's the same enemy. And therefore we need to link arms and figure out how it is to make all of these small movements and large movements too, these minority movements and these majority movements that are for the same thing, to come together. We have to move towards progress. We cannot remove or struggle from the person next to us.
Fair and square means equal.
That's good. Fair and square. Because you always say it's got to be fair and square, and then we have to always talk about equality. They're the same thing.
Okay, so I noticed the chat box kind of a few share out saying the sound was hard on that. I did have it up as loud as possible without creating an echo for y'all. If you will scroll back up to the top chat box, there is a link to the PBS interview that this is from, along with some teaching tools. So please utilize the link. But I think if we go any louder on that volume, it is going to echo in your ears. So I'm a little concerned on going louder on that volume. But all right. Is anybody having trouble finding the link to this video so y'all can watch it after? If y'all will take your in your chat box, go all the way up to the very top. My post is there. Let me copy it again.
I got it. No worries.
Okay. Did you get it for us, Wendy?
I did.
Wendy is on top of this. She is the webinar chat monitoring pro.
I don't know about that, but thank you. Okay.
Okay. So thank you, Wendy, for getting us back on track. So, all right. Is there anybody that did hear that had any key takeaways that they want to share out in the chat box? I know that sound is difficult, but I'll give y'all a few seconds to hear or post. There's one specific line that I know is always a takeaway for me as I watch that particular clip, but I want to give y'all a chance to hear from y'all first, and then we'll talk through my takeaway. All right, so what I will do, I'm just going to go ahead and give you all a short summary. Basically, what we see in the video is the interviewer asking Stacieann, like, how did you come to this place in your work? And one of the core quotes that she says in there is, we cannot remove our struggle from the person next to us. And she talks about reading bell hooks and reading, Audre Lorde and the things that she started to explore, and how her own personal journey was seeing that the issue that she wanted to advocate for was bigger. And I hate to fully summarize her words because those are her words, but was bigger than just the one single issue. And that is ultimately what an anti-oppression framework looks like when we are updating how we serve survivors of sexual violence, is we start to recognize the things we're hearing and the things we're seeing are rooted in bigger issues. And so we can't just take this one small slice. Now we can be an expert in our craft and be professionally competent and sound, but that is significantly different from saying, I just care about sexual violence. So, and I've worked in this field a long time. I worked at the local level, did some stuff outside of this with other nonprofits, and I would get specifically donors or board members or community support, stakeholders that would come in and say, I'm down for this piece of the work, but I want to subtract this other piece of the work. And our work doesn't fully work that way, to really make and change and make services more accessible. We can't pick and choose sometimes. Now we can have things that are closer to us. We can have things that we're more passionate about, but being informed and fully understanding these issues for the people that are living through them is imperative for us to do this work well. And I'll be the first to admit, there are times when I've messed up. There are times um, that I'm not always good at this. There are times when I have upheld with my own values, my own beliefs, systems of oppression. So I hold privilege as well as I have been victim to oppression. So, all right, we are going to move to this next slide. So when you're moving to an anti-oppression lens, so a scope that really is going to uncover and dig into these issues, we start with analysis. These three questions are pretty powerful, and you start to think about them and you start to look at them and you're like, wow, I've never taken the time to answer these questions. But when you start answering these questions, what you find out, who holds the power, who doesn't hold the power, and you identify what's not exactly equitable. And sometimes you uncover things that make you uncomfortable, and that's okay. Like there is the magic kind of happens outside of our comfort zone. So it's okay to discover things or ideas that are uncomfortable, and start working towards changing those rather than just pretending that they don't exist, ignoring them, shoving them back in the closet and hoping they just go away on their own. So those three questions, who benefits? Who benefits from this policy? Who benefits from this practice? Who benefits from this way of doing? Social media is a really good example. Who benefits from seeing this Instagram post? And who doesn't? Like who doesn't benefit from this particular message? And then who benefits differently? And I think question number 3 is probably the one that we, or that I myself need to work on the most, because that is definitely a question that I'm not used to asking. I'm used to asking the first two, but the third one, who benefits differently, really expands your way of thinking, your way of looking at an issue, because some people can partially benefit and some people will benefit in a different way. And so there's sometimes when we're planning through things or looking at making changes to how we do things, there's unintended consequences, and this can help you see a few of those possibly before and possibly plan for and possibly think through. And then sometimes some of those unintended consequences are things you can't see, and you do need to go back and you do need to reapproach and rechange. And that's what ongoing evaluation and assessment and analysis really looks like. So, all right, Wendy, I think I had a question or a comment. Would you mind reading that one to me, the very last one?
I'm talking and I've muted myself. I'm sorry. It says it seems like
That's okay.
the question is, it seems like who benefits differently can be a hard question to answer in some situations.
I definitely agree with that. I totally 100% agree with that, because as we're fixing to talk about in these next few slides, we build these systems based on what we know and what we believe. Somebody who might benefit differently from an approach, if their voice is not at the table, we may make that answer based on an assumption, based on a stereotype, based on a bias, based on a myth about that a group of people or that person. So this one can be a difficult question to answer. It takes time, and you have to be fully prepared to acknowledge you may not get this answer 100% correct every single time. So, all right. So as we move towards integrating an anti-oppression framework, when I say framework, this is a way of thinking and doing. That's what I'm referring to. We start this work with our individual ability to accept responsibility for our role in perpetrating oppression. I hate oppression. I hate rape culture. I hate sexism and racism and fat phobia and classism and ableism. I hate all of those forms of power. I hate all of the ways they create inequities. And sometimes I am individually responsible for holding them up. I make mistakes. I stubbornly hang on to old ideas. Um, and part of this work and growing in this work and working with people is adapting the interpersonal skills to change that. This is an undoing. And I think our old way of doing this and our old way of approaching this is we get the education, we get the knowledge, we check it off. We're like, oh, yeah, I've been to a workshop about African Americans. I've been to a workshop about the Latinx community. I've been to a workshop about the indigenous community. I'm here. I'm ready to go. I can help whoever. And I kind of say that with a little bit of a silly smirk because that's very much how I started in this work. I was very young when I got started, and I was a substance abuse counselor, and just okay, I'm ready. I'm completely ready to take this on. Do as I say. You will be sober, and we will all live happily ever after. So, almost 20 years down the line, I've changed my perspective on that just a little bit, and realized that that's not always going to be how it works. And the second step to this is making changes in a systematic way, in an institutional way, because those things, as I said before, they uphold our interpersonal beliefs, our interpersonal skills. So if we are coming from a place of privilege, and privilege can blind us, and we are coming from a place of power, we make decisions, we write policies, we make rules, we make personal practices and preferences that will uphold oppression. So, to bring about change, individuals and systems must be changed simultaneously. This is a top down approach, a bottom up approach, left to right, right to left, and constant exploration of who is this benefiting differently, the same way, and not at all. So, all right, so we're going to go through all of these principles of an integrated anti-oppression approach. The first one is society operates from a socially constructed hierarchy of difference. Some people are valued and some people have privilege. And privilege just means that the default, the extended trust, the extended compassion is just naturally there. The benefit of the doubt, if you will, is just naturally there for this particular group of people. Other people are marginalized and exploited, and I want to be careful with how often we use the word marginalized, because people that come from these communities, they know it, and they get tired of being told that they're marginalized. So we're using this word from an educational purpose, but I do want to be careful with how much, because there are groups of people that are like, yes, we know, and they want to be seen and heard and valued for different things, rather than just the fact that they come from a group of a community of people that are traditionally pushed out, that have accessibility issues, and that's accessibility beyond just physical access. And then exploitation often happens within helping organizations just as much as it happens outside. And we're going to talk a little bit about that more in a few more slides as we move down. This one is often a difficult one for us to remember too. People do not belong to just one category or social location. Our individual identities are very complex. They're constantly moving in and out as we learn, as we grow, as we change, as we age, have new experiences, meet new people. Our capacity to understand our identities grow, and therefore who we are and how we present ourselves to the world grows. Our interests, the people we associate with, all of that is very fluid and it's constantly changing. We traditionally treat this as something that's very static, and something that's just one thing, right? Often based on those split, identity judgments, and just saying, oh yeah, well, you are Latino, so you must know how to cook menudo. I'm probably the only one in my family that doesn't, but a lot of people assume that. And that's a real minor reference, but as we get into talking with survivors, their identities really become a core part of their healing, and learning their identities over making an assumption based on a cultural stereotype is more important. So it's again this process of undoing. We can be both victims and perpetrators of aggression, especially microaggressions. And I love, and I cannot credit who came up with this particular analogy, but it's been around for a long time. Microaggressions being compared to mosquito bites. They're tiny, they're small, but over time, you have 10 mosquito bites, you have 20, you have 30, you have 50, and those small wounds just kind of add up. It's those small little tiny comments. Oh, you're so exotic. You're so pretty. Just have that exotic look to you. Oftentimes, they can be written off as just a mistake, unintentional. I'm really trying to be nice. I just messed up. So they're easy to write off, but over time they do stack up. They do cause stress. They do cause emotional harm over time. And then the third piece of this is the idea of a dominant culture. And this one makes sense when you start to think through it. Thoughts, values, attitudes, beliefs, and ideas of those who belong, who are in community, are the things that become dominant. They take over because you have the most people. So you might hear something like, "Oh, I'm American. I have no culture," right? It's because it's the dominant culture. It's the thing we see. It's the thing we hear. It's the thing we do. It's so present in our society, we don't even see it anymore. It's natural, it's safe, it's comfortable, can be fun, can be something we can value and appreciate, but it's there as the dominant piece. Where this becomes important is because it is the standard and is the norm, everything else gets compared to it. If I'm outside of that standard and I'm in that part of counterculture or just something that's not a day-to-day experience, that's the wrong piece. And we kind of label things as good and bad when they really don't even need those labels there, but like that's the right way to do it, that's the wrong way to do it. I think, Wendy, I'm going to steal your story here, but you talk about this a lot. I've heard you tell this story a lot about your family cooking and how you would cut part of the end off because of the pan size. And one day somebody comes in and says, what the heck? Why do we cook it this way? And everybody's like, I don't know. That's just what we do, right? So did I get the story right, Wendy?
Pretty much, but it's not our family story, but yeah, it's a family story. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So that's just the way of doing, right? It's the norm, and we don't often question that. People who belong to this privileged group, which is often the dominant group, they have the control access to resources and information. This is an important piece of this because when we go back to what I talked about in the very beginning, we are wanting to promote dignity. We are wanting to promote respect. We are wanting to promote empowerment for the people that we serve. If they cannot control access, if they do not have appropriate access made available to them, it robs them of those things. It robs them of dignity first and foremost. And I think that's the most important piece of this particular principle. Privilege robs people of dignity. And I'm going to repeat that one more time. Privilege robs people of their personal dignity. So we are talking about survivors who have already had their autonomy stripped away, who have already been in a place of degradation, humiliation, who have had power and control used to harm them in unimaginable ways, further being stripped of that dignity, further being stripped of the ability to think and make choices or come into a space where they feel safe, where they feel respected, where they feel included, and they don't have to hide. I have worked with so many survivors from the LGBT community for so many years now. who have had to change the gender of their perpetrator or their partner because it hasn't been clearly communicated to them, either by me or by society as a whole. This happens to a lot of people. It can happen this way. It's okay for you to tell me your truth and your experience. And I'm going to get into the idea of trust here in a minute, but the fact that somebody would have to come in and change their story, that doesn't benefit them. That doesn't give them any dignity or give them a clearer path to finding their own sense of justice or their own sense of healing. That's their dignity. Unequitable access to knowledge and resources exploits and disempowers people from being able to fully shape their own past, present, and future. So representation becomes a huge issue here. What you see, how people think, how people believe. Not everyone from the same social group has the same experiences. People can have multiple marginalized identities. People can have experiences where they are pushed out, and they are not merely just facing an extra barrier. This is a completely different lived experience, and I feel really passionate about talking about people's lived experience because there are a lot of things that we can relate to, we can identify with our clients, we can connect on many, many different levels. I love that piece of the work, and I love that piece of the connection, and say, oh, you too? Yeah. And you just have that moment, right? But everybody has a unique and valuable lived experience. And so when we talk about re-victimization and taking it one step further, when we don't allow people to share their lived experience with us, it it re-victimizes in a completely different way. Because they're not seen, right? And so this is where we talk a lot about, and we hear us updating our language around using the phrase, I don't see color, or I don't see race, or I don't see. I want to be seen. Like, and as a person of color, as a woman of color, as a Latina, I want to be seen. I want to walk through certain piece of experiences, and I don't want to be just lumped in. Like, and I think all people in some way, shape, or form want to be seen. They want to be heard. And they want to have a voice. And we heard this at the TAASA conference this year too, is as advocates, it's our duty and our responsibility to stop saying, I am a voice for the voiceless. So our keynote speaker, very clearly and very boldly said, if you use that phrase, I want to be a voice for the voiceless, or I am a voice for the voiceless, the last time you said it, make it the last. Like, move past that. And our role is to, give people their chance to showcase their voice, because we all have one, and it should be seen, it should be heard, and it's pretty cool whenever you get those experiences. All right, so this gets us into a little bit of an exercise. Hope you're still awake and still with me. We're going to compare the anti-oppression framework that I've just given y'all and the principles that I've just walked through with y'all to some of the past ways of doing, some ways that I for sure know that I was trained in, because I've been doing this work for a little bit of time now. So you may have also been trained in them too. I'm not telling us to throw the baby out with the bathwater here and just stop doing these particular practices, but we want to look at some of the limitations and just compare them to some of this newer stuff that we've been introduced and talked about. So the first one we're going to start with is the policy of formal equality. This one is still important. I don't want us to stop using the word equal, because we don't need to stop using the word equal. There's just some limitations to this approach, and I want us to think through them. So a formal equality policy often sounds like, when we're talking about it in the field, looks like on paper, a phrase similar to, we serve everyone here. No client is turned away from. And we've all written grants, we've all written mission statements. we know what this sounds like. There's multiple variations of the we serve everyone approach to our work. The rules are the same for everyone. Nobody gets a special consideration or favors. Equal, equal, equal. And the logic behind this is same rule, same results, same outcome. Therefore, no discrimination. No one's left out. No one's left behind, because the approach has been very systematic, and we just eliminated the problem. Okay. So there are some flaws in this thinking, and that's what we're going to use the chat box for next. So I'm going to give y'all a chance to go ahead and chat out some, I'm giving y'all the answer. Some flaws based on what I've just presented to y'all, those theories, those principles. What can be some flaws in this particular way of thinking and doing? Oh, this is a good one. Not everyone interprets the rules the same way. That is a core piece of this one. Anybody else? Everyone has different experiences, expects a different outcome. So expectations are a little tricky thing, aren't they?
I don't know if you saw the one above that, but it says, as individuals, we have individual needs.
Yes, yes. Actual practice and on paper, yeah, Sarah, you got that one. Rules don't, in actual practice, look the same for everyone. Sometimes we bend a little, sometimes we break a little. I've never done that, but you know. So. Doesn't take into account different barriers. There's Denise, doesn't assume we're starting at the same place. So doesn't consider some folks have limitations to access to the same resources. So. It doesn't account, we have some good feedback here. JJ says it doesn't account for service providers' reaction to the survivor's identity.
And Brenda, you're doing a private chat, so I'm reading it, so forgive me if you don't want to. But what you have said is the interpretation of consistency is dependent upon the translation of the service provider.
Oh, that's a good one too. Yep. All right, we'll give you all about 30 more seconds. Personal biases. Yep, personal biases have not been accounted for here. Especially if those rules were created with personal biases. All right. So the answer that I have on my slide connects very well to everything we've shared, everything we've talked about. It reduces the experience of oppression based on the false idea that the problem has been eliminated by following the rules. Very very simplistic way of kind of saying it's not that simple. It's not that clean. It's not that clear. And I often think through. I've sent a lot of people out for mental health treatment, and that's more of a clinical environment, especially when I'm trying to get somebody access to and help with prescription, and that's a very clinical, very formal environment that I've had to send a lot of people into. And the policy is appointments start on the hour. They go from noon to 12:50. They start, they end. It's very clinical. You got to move them through the next and get the next person. If you get there at 12:05 or 12:15, you cannot see a provider. Doesn't account for I've had to take 2 buses and walk 10 blocks in Texas heat index weather of 111 to 115 degrees while carrying a small child. Um, so that clear cut, we do this the same way so that everybody can get this particular service. Doesn't always account for what's going on outside of us. So I think, and this is really reiterated for me when I'm having to do work or I'm having to pull like community needs assessments, which has a lot of information about populations and that kind of data that's very, very helpful for us to understand our community, but it doesn't really give us the full picture. It's a lot of numbers and things like that. But you'll get community stakeholders who have done interviews about services in the community, and you'll see responses documented that say things like, I know our community has a lot of services. People just don't care to show up. So what do y'all think about a statement like that? Anybody want to share out in the chat box? What is a statement like that? Where does it hit based on what we've been talking about today? All right, so I'll give y'all a little bit more time to think about those kinds of statements because we've probably all heard them in some way, shape, or form. Hopefully, we haven't said them too often. Yeah, it's the monopoly of privilege and not thinking outside the box. Great. Oh, a savior complex. That one gets into some deep thinking too. That's a very personal thing that people can bring into the work, and it often gets shown in how we talk about clients. It's also very, very, very indicative of burnout. When we start hearing ourselves say that a lot, there's some personal work that needs to be done in that realm. Okay, so we're gonna move on to our next framework. Then this one is cultural competence. Again, let's not throw this one out completely. A lot of us started here, and again, as we know more, as we've learned more, we do better with this work. So the basic premise of cultural competence is to encourage people to include diverse groups into their existing framework and their existing patterns of doing, and the practices are inclusive and welcome, and they're informed by education about diverse groups of people. Again, this is more of a checklist approach. I don't think it tended to be that way in the beginning, but in multiple ways, it became that. We would learn about different groups of people that weren't like us or didn't do things the way we did. And then we would kind of feel comfortable to, you can come to me and trust me. I know I got the certificate, or I read that book, or I saw that movie. So I know now how to work with you. I know now what your lived experience is. And a lot of people put a lot of effort into cultural competence and are still evolving that work too. But for some people, that's where it went. So as we did before, y'all did a really good job with this. What are some of the flaws of this particular approach?
And okay, Crystal, before we move on, there was one more comment from the last section, and it says, it shuts down the conversation and makes it less likely for someone to engage in further discussion as to why people don't show up, for example.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing us back to that, Wendy, because it really, I think that's a key phrase right there. Shuts down the conversation. Like it just
That's
ends
Sarah
it.
McPherson's
Yeah.
words, not mine. I'm
Yeah.
reading from Sarah. So thank you, Sarah.
All right, so just take a second to think through some flaws of cultural competence. All right, so then cultural competence leads to stereotyping and overgeneralizing a group of people. So, absolutely. Any other flaws we can identify? Some people might still be typing. All right, Sarah saying it makes people think there's a sense of being done. Yes, the completion, right? Once we've learned the term or the skill, it's just, unrealistic and unattainable. Like we just can't learn everything. So, and Tracy sharing tends to lean more into generalizations versus those life experiences. Oh, Olivia, this is a great way to describe it. Cultural competency is seen as a destination. Once people believe they've arrived, they stop working to understand. So, and Kathleen, the sense of having accomplished something rather than it being an ongoing learning process. Great. All right, Cassandra, along with stereotyping, implicit bias comes in. Um, because even though we are aware of our norms and generalizations, we find it harder to recognize it in ourselves. And I think, if I can follow up that with a second talking point, is what we learn from other advocates who model um, things for us. So JJ just commented, I can never be culturally competent in someone else's culture. So, and I have to give a shout out to JJ because he's the one that modeled for me the ability to walk into a workshop on these topics and say, I have upheld these systems. I am a racist. I am a sexist at times. And so, him putting that out there helped me learn how to put it out there too, and check my own ego at times. All right, we have time to talk through a few more responses. So anybody else have anything else they want to share in the chat box? All right, so just what I have on my slide. and thinking through my own answer to this, the approach is limited because the dominant culture is accepted as the norm. Diversity is anything outside of that norm. So, what may be a normal day experience to my home, because that's where, I live and work and do, all of a sudden it becomes weird to somebody else. And then I'm in the diverse group, but it doesn't feel diverse. It doesn't feel different to me because that's my everyday experience. That's always how I've done it. And then the second one is power and privilege are not examined. They're really upheld a lot of times with cultural competence, because it really doesn't push you. It's I've included this person at my table. I've included this other person at my table. So therefore I'm okay and how I've acted. And then my third flaw in this approach, it really puts vulnerable people in a sticky position where they are asked to trust us because I am the expert on the topic. I am the advocate in this position, or I'm the counselor in this position. So you must trust me. I'm a safe person because I'm saying I'm a safe person, rather than you being able to speak up and say, when you said this or did this, it felt this way to me. Um, it made me feel this way. So it often puts our the people that we're helping, those vulnerable people, in a position to where they can't really speak up um, if something were to happen to them. All right, so the second piece of this process is we're going to focus on moving forward with social justice, and social justice is a big piece of mitigating oppression, and making things different. So as we do that, I want to talk about some of the big pitfalls, common mistakes that people make as they're moving forward, and have a little bit of time to really talk about racial fetishism. This isn't something we talk about too often in the work, but we know it. Like we really know this, but we can't always explain why this is a problem, which is something I want to get better at as an advocate. Um, it's very commonly seen in incidents of sexual violence that there is an additional layer of that victim experiencing a sexually violent crime connected to a fetish based on their race or their appearance. So I chose these particular pictures based on Latinas. This can be expanded, this can be narrowed for different people, but this is what I kind of felt comfortable in talking through my own experiences with this. Some of the stereotypes. I love some of these reasons you should date a Latina. You'll never go hungry. Curves for days. Hair is real, so pull it. Um, Imagine coming in to talk to somebody about what has happened to you, and the assumption being made that the hair is real, so pull it, and trying to explain what was happening to you during this violent crime, and having it kind of written off as, oh, well, don't y'all like that? Or, oh, um, the anger, or the fact that, Latinos carry knives. We all have a knife, being something that dismisses that experience. And so often, since we are not talking about this particular way that we fetishize people based on their race, or what makes people attractive or not attractive, again, I always go back to the comments that I've consistently heard about having an exotic look. It often makes it difficult for people to talk about the crime of sexual violence, because those stereotypes really get layered in. And so people make assumptions about your body, or what you enjoy, what you don't enjoy, how you look, how you dress, and they sexualize them. And then that further leads into that victim blame that we are consistently trying to turn around. We're having the same conversations. Bad fashion is not an excuse for aggression. I've been saying that for many, many, many years, but we're still talking about what the victim was wearing, how a tight dress might fit on a different kind of body. This also came back up again in terms of big bodies and fat bodies, where we started seeing judges or law enforcement saying that body is so big or that body is so small, who'd want to rape them? That's our work. That is our day in and day out. Reasons that most of us check out of social media is because we just hear these messages over and over and over again. But then we can also perpetrate them when we interact with people, even if we think it's just a compliment. There's sometimes we are talking to people, and I've seen this perpetrated a lot when it comes to talking about hair and advocates or counselors or people wanting to touch somebody's hair and doing so without consent, and just making it into this fetish about how beautiful it is and how gorgeous it is. And it's like, okay, yes, physically attractive, wonderful person, please don't touch their hair. And that's a little bit of a joke, but at the same time, we have to be careful with how we're treating clients and playing up those different beauty standards. The next one is tokenism, and this one in and of itself, I really wanted to talk about it in today's webinar. However, I want to be very, very clear that this particular topic could be an entire webinar in and of itself. This is a very, very big topic, but it is something that we often do because sometimes we're going to look towards who's not coming into our doors, and we'll say we should be serving more of this particular type of person. And so we'll start putting social media messages out there, or we'll start talking about or start going into these communities and saying, please come to my table and please come and give your opinion on my services or participate in these community assessments. And we're not actually including them. They're just there to make it look good. And I like the pictures I've included. I've used them for a long time, but this was a particular campaign where Victoria's Secret was in trouble for not making size inclusive clothes. They haven't particularly changed that practice. So another company comes in and says, hey, look at these bodies, couple sizes bigger. They look great too. And they kind of it was more of the same. So another community organization kind of came back and did a different campaign, the Empower Bodies campaign, where they made it look, and this is a no photoshopped, completely different picture where they included different abilities, completely different shapes. They included trans people in this, and it looks like more representation. These people, and of course, when this campaign was going on, these people were very vocal talking about what it meant to be in this campaign, and there were videos and things like this. So it was a more complete package, and people really were included, rather than I'm having you here at the table. You have no real power. You have no real voice. Sit there, follow the potted plant rule, and just make it look good. And this is something, especially when it comes to fundraising, that can be very difficult to navigate. And really has to be done with a lot of care and a lot of time and a lot of planning and a lot of really difficult conversations, and asking yourself, what is the real motivation for this particular action, this particular change, this particular representation. So, and then the final kind of pitfall that a lot of people will fall into is the piece on cultural appropriation. Again, this is a slide I've used for a long time, poor Katy Perry. But ultimately, when we're talking about cultural appropriation, is we are taking these trusted values, these trusted experiences for culture, and we're putting them out there to make it look like we get it, to make it look like we're a place to come to, a person to talk to, and we're really just capitalizing on that to achieve something. And it's a very common mistake that people are trying to show that this is a progressive place where we're trying to change how we're doing things, and we will fall into this trap where we have taken something that doesn't belong to us, taken a snippet of that experience or a stereotype of that experience, and tried to put it out there as I get it, and then it kind of backfires on us. So trying and really pandering to people of color or people with different life experiences. So the quote here on the slide is, if you don't understand cultural appropriation, imagine working on a project, getting an F, and then someone copies you and gets an A and the credit. So and this happens a lot all over the place. And so it's just something we have to watch out for. It's something you have to think through. It is possible to appreciate a culture and not appropriate it. That does fall on a spectrum. But if it's not on your radar, more likely to happen. Any questions on those pitfalls before we move forward? Awesome.
There doesn't
All
appear to
right,
be any.
so we are getting close to the end on this, and this is kind of my wrap up and closing, is really thinking through what the principles of social justice look like in actual practice. So I want y'all to keep that in mind, because we are going to share out as we close this the webinar up, and think through what does this look like on paper? What does this look like on actual practice? And how do we move forward with this particular framework rather than committing some of those pitfalls that we just talked about? So the first principle that we want to focus on is equity. The particular icon here, you see it looking a little bit different, where people, and working towards equity is to ensure a fair distribution of available across society, helping people achieve and get what they need to be successful. Slightly different from just focusing on removing barriers. Because as we've seen, and as I talked a little bit about with the bus pass example, I've given my fair share of bus passes for people to get to appointments. That didn't necessarily ensure access. That didn't ensure that they would arrive at their mental health appointment in a timely manner. But I did my part. I gave out that bus pass, right? Now the rest is on them. But there may be additional steps that you might need to take to ensure equitable access versus equal access. So equal access might look like all clients with transportation issues get assigned a bus pass. No questions asked, no judgment about how they use the bus pass. If they go to the mall or they go to their appointment, that's on them. You know, those kinds of things. And then an equitable response might be to talk through this person, to look through what's the best place. Is this the best referral? Can I make a closer one? Can I advocate on behalf of my clients with the Department of Transportation? Is that something I might need to have a seat at that table with when they plan the bus routes in my community? Am I getting in there and giving feedback on that and saying, I send a large number of people to this address, and I can look at that address and say, is this bus route even coming close? Is there a place where I can speak up and put some feedback and put some impact, like, you know, this is what I'm seeing, this is where I'm at. So equity looks different than equal. The next principle is access, ensuring people have access to goods and services regardless of age, gender, ethnicity, etc. Access, often we think of physical space, and sometimes we don't think enough of physical space. How do people get in the door? And I think Maya Pilgrim, our evaluation manager, is always saying this. I've learned this from her. No data is data. So we do want to also look at who's not coming into the door. And without tokenizing, without appropriating them, there may be some hard questions to answer. Are they not coming in the door because they have found another place where they would prefer to pursue their healing? Or are we culpable in not ensuring the access is there? So the next principle, participation, and helping to enable people to participate in decisions that affect their lives. People have their voice. People have the ability to make decisions, and having a positive regard and a hope that they can, even if we make a completely different decision, doesn't make that decision wrong. And we are facilitators in that process, not necessarily doers. When we're not making those decisions for people, we're just giving them that pathway, giving them that opportunity and that autonomy to do what they think is best for them. And it's not personal, I think. And when we talk about participation, it is not personal when people make decisions that are different from the decisions they should make. And a lot of times that becomes very personal in a professional role, but it's not personal. It's not about us. And this is where we start to have to look at things like the savior complex that we've discussed. Is what am I really bringing? What is my intention here? What is my part in this? What is my role in this, and why am I so hell bent on them making this decision the way I want them to? And the last piece of a social justice mindset is to ensure rights, and this is to protect individual liberties, to information about circumstances and decisions affecting them, and to appeal decisions that people feel are unfair. So, and allowing that process to unfold and go forward. A lot of times we will block people's rights because it's very uncomfortable, or we don't want to see the outcome. Sometimes there's ego that plays into that, but really ensuring that people have access to their rights, and then what role can we play in improving that process. So. Okay, so we're moving now into the closing of the webinar, and we are just going to spend some time talking through with the chat box of these 3 particular topics here. And like I said before, this is a 2-part webinar. So this first piece has been focusing on this awareness and education. Next week, we're going to really hit onto the action piece of this, and our panel members, Holly Cochran and Sundal, will be coming in to talk about what this work really looks like on the ground in Texas. It's not easy work. It's slow work. It's hard work. So we have these fantastic panel members that are going to be coming in and giving audience members a chance to interact with them. They're going to be sharing about some of those strengths and some of those barriers. So I'm going to leave that critical work to them and close with these 3 questions for us to talk through and discuss, and then we'll take overall questions at the end of the webinar. So our first question, I'll give you all some time to think about all 3, but we're going to start with the green box. What does it mean to have a commitment to cultural capacity? What does that look like on paper? So those are 2 slightly different questions, but interpersonally, what does that mean to be committed to this? And then when I put this down on paper, what does that look like? So we're going to start there, and give yourself a little bit of time to think about it. And as y'all get ready, answers in the chat box. All right, so this is from Wendy. For me, it means finding a way to ask the survivor for information that encourages a response and information. And I think if I can add on, a piece to that, Wendy, and there's a distinction between getting a survivor to tell their story and tell their lived experience and share that with us, versus making them do the labor of explaining their culture or their identity to us. So
Right.
Right.
It's not about, I have heard over and over, regardless of where the client is in their, wherever they come from, wherever a survivor comes from, that they are frustrated by having to teach. So for me, when I talk about getting information that is necessary to help or to move a case forward, to understand that the language being used may be formal institutional language, and I don't need to I need to get information. I need to get information in a way that we understand each other without, like by using neutral language or by using open-ended questions.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make more sense?
That does make sense.
Okay. It's about me understanding what's necessary, not the other way around.
Does
And I
anybody have any
apologize
other?
for talking instead of typing it in.
That's okay. Anyone have any other responses to this particular green box here? Creating a safe place. And Jillian, if you could expand just a little bit more on that, I don't want to assume for you. What does that look like for you on paper? Like, how would you put that into practice? Okay. So a space that's unbiased and the person's free to share without judgment. So, awesome. So, and she's following up with not feeling or thinking someone is plotting or going to harm the individual. Okay, so we have about 6 minutes left in our webinar, and I do want to get just a couple of seconds. Like I said, these 3 core questions right here are going to be the foundation that pushes into part 2 of this webinar. So I hope y'all come back with our live panel members. But the next 2 questions are, what does commitment to cultural capacity look like in day-to-day practice? This is a question we have to answer because and I find myself in this position too. I know something. I want to be able to explain it. I need to be able to explain it, and I need to be able to do it. And I need that knowledge to translate into behavior. And how do I make that happen? What skills would you like to grow in order to contribute to the commitment that we talked about in this first question? So we can take a few more answers to these particular questions, and then we'll kind of wrap up and close out this webinar for today. Commitment to learning on your own, reviewing public resources, not expecting someone from that community to teach you everything. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
This is also a particularly important place, especially when we're talking about bilingual services, translation services, who we put in a position to translate. Often children will be put in a position to translate for parents. Because we haven't thought through and we don't know what we're going to do in those kinds of situations. So we just kind of make this split fact judgment, and it puts a lot of burden on people that are consistently tired trying to teach. So. So any more comments on these questions that we've discussed in terms of moving from awareness into action? Oh, this is a great point. Sometimes it means showing up, and sometimes it means not showing up. But step up, step back, um, to protect the integrity of a space.
Crystal, did you see the question?
Is there?
Yeah.
Yes. Is there a danger in learning about a culture and appropriating it because you've learned about it? Yes, I would say yes. That is kind of a novice mistake that people make. And a good support system, a good call-in sometimes is very helpful in correcting that. And not all education about is actually rooted or comes from that particular community. Sometimes it's taken from other people and kind of put out there. So learning is important, but also being mindful that these pitfalls can happen, and just checking through, talking through, asking questions, educating, and then taking the time to really make these good decisions. And then if it goes wrong, make it right. So, all right. So the follow-up question is, so who could that be without making that person responsible for teaching you? Maybe other professional colleagues, maybe other networks and resources that specifically put themselves out there to be an educational resource. Because it's very different from the client in and of themselves. So. All right, so I want to get y'all out of here in a timely manner. Very appreciative of y'all spending the morning with us. So are there any other questions, comments, things we need to say as we close today?
Okay, while you all are chatting that in, I'm just going to remind you of some housekeeping stuff. One is that in about an hour after I close down this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email to the address under which you registered. In that email will be an evaluation. TAASA asks that you return it because if you ever need a verification that you attended this webinar, I will have that on file, and our funders do require that we get some evaluation information here. Number two, it will have a copy of this PowerPoint for you to use. And number three, or refer back to, and number three, it will be, excuse me, you will get a link to your certificate of attendance for today. So I thank you very much and remind you that part 2 is in a week on next Friday from 10 to 11:30. I apologize for the phone ringing in the background. And we'll see. Hope to see you all there. Thank you. Crystal,
I'm still on the line. Yep.
I think we're done here. So I'm going to mute you. I'm going to mute me. Excuse me. And I am going to close this down in a few minutes, or I'll keep us going keep it open just in case someone has any questions that come in at the last minute. Okay? But I am going to mute us.
Yeah, I'll watch the chat and everybody make sure.
Okay. All right.
Nothing else for me.